Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Bitcoin Curve podcast. My name is Arvind, and in today's episode, we are going to be diving into Bitcoin's principles. Now, this will be episode 1 of 3 in this Bitcoin Principles series, and in this episode, we're going to dive into 3 key areas. Firstly, what are principles? Second, what does the internet and the broader Bitcoin community believe the principles are today? And finally, I'm going to provide you my lens as to what I believe Bitcoin's principles are. And my views here have been evolving over the last 3 years, and the conclusions that I've drawn is what's led to the Bitcoin curve itself. So I'm really excited to share that journey with you, and I hope you enjoy it. And so with that, let's dive into it. Before we dive into what are Bitcoin's principles, I'm a big fan of ensuring that as I'm communicating this to you, that we are both speaking the same language. And to start this off, I want to start with what the Oxford Dictionary's definition for a principle is. Because if I were to ask you today, without looking at the dictionary, can you define what a principle is? I'm going to assume that a lot of you are going to struggle with being very concise and very accurate in your articulation of it. And that's quite normal, to be frank, because when I posed this question to myself, even I struggled before I did the work. And so to make sure that we're speaking the same language and that when I use the word principles, you understand where I'm coming from, here's what the Oxford Dictionary says principles are and something that I also align to. So a principle is a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behavior or for a chain of reasoning. Now, when I read this for the first time, there were 2 things there that really resonated with me. The first was a fundamental truth or proposition, and the second being the foundation. These 2 terms of fundamental and foundation is going to pop up a few times as I go through this podcast episode. And I want you to keep that in the back of your mind so you can start to understand how my thinking was evolving, because it was really anchored to this notion of fundamental and foundation. And the other way that I start to think about principles, and this has been drawn from my professional career, is I often like to think of principles as a North Star. If we think about something that is foundational or fundamental, if we think about this as striving towards something as well, the principles that you live by, I like to use the term a North Star because it brings the analogy of a sailor on the sea. North Star is something that you can anchor yourself to so that you can ensure that as you travel, you are consistently pointed in the right direction. If that North Star is off even a fraction, all the work that you do leads you to a different outcome. And so understanding the fundamental nature of your principles becomes important, because if you get it wrong, all the subsequent work that you do will always lead you to the wrong destination. So that's how I think about principles. And now diving into Bitcoin's principles. When you go onto the internet, as I usually do, and as many of you will do on your Bitcoin journey, you're going to come up with a raft of different examples as to what the internet and the broader public thinks Bitcoin principles are. In a similar way that we did this for defining Bitcoin in the last episode, I've got a few examples as to what the internet would say Bitcoin's principles are from 3 sources. So the first comes from Wikipedia, and I will read it out. So the key components and principles are a peer-to-peer decentralized network with no central oversight, the blockchain technology, a public ledger that records all Bitcoin transactions, mining and proof of work, the process to create new Bitcoins and verify transactions, and cryptographic security. Now, just a quick comment on this particular piece from Wikipedia. At the very start of that, it says its key components and principles. So off the bat, we've got the conflation of components and principles here. And if we think back to what the definition was that I just read out of what a principle is, which is foundational and fundamental, you cannot have components being that and principles being the same thing as components. So here I'd say it's generalized, it's very, very high level. And what we're seeing in what Wikipedia are saying is components and principles are largely just components. Another example. So if you go to bitcoin.it, they've got a wiki and they've got a page specifically called Principles of Bitcoin. And they define these principles as being 21 million coins, no censorship, open source, permissionless, pseudonymous, fungible, and irreversible transactions. Similar to Wikipedia, when I look through this and I take it through the lens of principles, fundamental, foundational, all of these read more as components rather than principles. So I would argue that these are more components. Maybe you could call them design principles, but not quite hitting the mark yet. And the final one that I'll quickly run through was from bitcoin.design. And again, these are design principles. And they list these as being self-custody, security, inclusion, interoperability, transparency, privacy, and decentralization. Now, of the three, I think the one that I just read out there is probably the closest to being what I would consider principles. Because when I look at this, I see words like inclusion, transparency, privacy. And these aren't components in themselves, rather they are the principles by which components are built to deliver against. And the final one that I'll go to, only because I think this is the way that search is going to be done into the future, especially with now tools like ChatGPT, Google's Gemini. We're not going to really be searching Google and then trying to find these things. We're going to see what AI tells us is the collective perspective of the internet and all the material it has access to. So if you go to ChatGPT and ask it, what are the principles of Bitcoin? It comes up with this: decentralization, limited supply, proof of work, transparency and immutability, pseudonymity, open source, global accessibility, resistance to censorship, security, and portability and divisibility. So I think that there is this common thread in everything that we've just walked through here around these principles, which are, they are more components of the technology itself rather than what I would consider principles. And that in itself tells you that you're not at the most fundamental or foundational. Because when you start doing a lot of the reading and the listening to thought leaders within the space of Bitcoin, you get something far deeper than what you see. And it's at this point that, as a researcher, an independent one, I don't just look at what I can find on Google through a general search or a ChatGPT search, but I draw from academia. Because this is where we've got some of the greatest experts and greatest minds in our society doing incredible work through peer-reviewed literature and more formal academic writing. And to give you a flavor as to what you can find if you go onto Google Scholar and put in the search Bitcoin and Bitcoin's principles, there was one article that stuck with me when I read it, and it levels up some of the things that I've read through so far. And so this paper that I'll read an excerpt from will give you a taste of that. The paper is titled Bitcoin, Economics, Technology, and Governance, and it has 4 authors. The lead author, Rainer Bohm, and subsequent authors, Nicholas Christen, Benjamin Edelman, and Tyler Moore. Now, I will put a link to this article into the description below so that you can go and read it yourself. But the thing that really drew me to this article were the 4 authors themselves, because these 4 authors come from very different disciplines. Rainer is a professor of security and privacy. You've got Nicholas Christen, who is a professor of electrical and computer engineering. You've got Benjamin Edelman, who is a professor of business administration. And then you've got Tyler Moore, who is a professor of computer science and engineering. And so just in that, yes, you've got some engineering disciplines, you've got some business disciplines, and security and privacy. These very different perspectives means that in order to even publish an article like this formally, those 4 needed to get to a level of consensus because all 4 of their names are on this paper. And what's great about this is, instead of seeing a single perspective from a single domain. What you're seeing is the collective understanding from four very diverse people coming together and producing something that I think is incredibly high quality. And so in a portion of their paper on page 3 of their article, they go through 2 paragraphs describing what are Bitcoin's design principles. And I'm going to read a little bit of this to you and then I'll dissect it. So they define Bitcoin's design principles as being: scarcity is the prerequisite for ascribing value to any form of money. At a micro level, scarcity protects against counterfeiting. More broadly, scarcity bounds the growth path of the monetary base and facilitates price stability. There's quite a bit in there and I'll skip through it, but I will put it up on the screen as well. The second paragraph then goes into, against this backdrop, Bitcoin can be understood as the first widely adopted mechanism to provide absolute scarcity of a money supply. By design, Bitcoin lacks a centralized authority to distribute coins or to track who holds which coins. Consequently, the process of issuing currency and verifying transactions is considerably more difficult than in the classic bookkeeping systems. Meanwhile, Bitcoin issues new currency to private parties at a controlled pace in order to provide an incentive for those parties to maintain its bookkeeping systems, including verifying the validity of transactions. Now, this is far longer form than what you would traditionally find online and far more complex and a narrative that weaves multiple concepts together. So going back to that first line, which I think anchors these principles, which is scarcity is the prerequisite for ascribing value to any form of money. The way that they've structured just these 2 paragraphs tells me a fair amount. Number one, it's scarcity is at the top of their principles list. They've also gone into other elements or mechanisms that support that scarcity. So things like mining, proof of work, although not spelt out, they have alluded to it here, as well as decentralization. And so I like this because just in this 2 paragraphs, they've been able to create a hierarchy and said which of these components is the most fundamental. And for these authors, from what I can read here, its scarcity is the highest of those orders, the most fundamental, the most foundational for this to be considered a money. So now we've got a high-level view of what the general public thinks about Bitcoin's principles. We've got a academic lens on principles. But now I want to take you through my experience and my personal summation as to what I've observed by being in the Bitcoin space for the last 3 to 4 years. And what I've observed is that the principles of Bitcoin fall into one of 3 categories. The first category is technical. So you are going to get a lot of what came out of the cypherpunk movement through to where it is today, and a lot of the technical features around decentralization, consensus, cryptography, the proof of work elements of Bitcoin, and amongst other technical elements that bring Bitcoin to life. And there are going to be design principles that underpin all of those components. So you've got this technical lens as to where these principles can come from. The second bucket, and the one that you'll start to hear a lot more of as we start to enter 2025 under the Trump presidency, is the monetary and economic elements of Bitcoin. So here you've probably got 2 camps. You've got the debate between Keynesian economics, which is what the prevailing economic system that a lot of the world is running on today in the reserve banking infrastructure, and Austrian economics. And just there are core principles that you can already see just in that, which is Bitcoin follows Austrian economics principles rather than Keynesian economics principles. And the other side to this bucket is then the nature of money itself. And so you start to go down to the history of money and you start to see the difference between hard money and soft money, or fiat currencies. And so you've got that bucket of economics and money. And the third one is around sovereignty and freedom. You would probably like to think of this as what Western democratic societies have allowed people to achieve in the form of freedom and self-sovereignty and autonomy versus what we sometimes see in more dictatorial, communist, or autocratic type societies being less freedom that has been stolen by the state. And so you have this huge area of, I would maybe even call it libertarianism, and how Bitcoin is a solve and to be able to achieve libertarianism. That would probably be the third bucket. These three buckets, I can see how there are principles that you could absolutely tie Bitcoin to. Hard money versus soft money, Austrian versus Keynesian, freedom, self-sovereignty, and autonomy over centralized control, and then a raft of technical principles that you follow in order to bring this whole system to life. And when you do spend like me, over 1,000 hours or so, really diving into the thought leaders of this space, this is where I've landed. And the problem that I always faced when I saw these principles in action was there was something in the back of my mind as I was going through this process myself that said, I haven't quite nailed what the fundamental principles are. It always seemed that there was something a bit more fundamental, a bit more foundational to everything that I was seeing. And the backstory that I'm going to take you through now is that journey of how I went from understanding those core three principle buckets, technical, economics and money, freedom and sovereignty, to where I am today. And I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey on my upbringing, because where I've come from very much informs how I think and how I came to my conclusions. And I want to take you on how my thinking has evolved over time so you can see the journey rather than the destination. And it's often the journey is more important than the destination, so that you can draw parallels from what I've observed and I've experienced to your own life, and hopefully come to the same conclusion as me. Or if you disagree, I would absolutely love to hear it. Put that in the comments down below. So my upbringing that sets my worldview, that is the lens by which I view the world, came from an Asian household. I was raised a Hindu, so there was religious foundations to my upbringing. My parents always believed in education and hard work. And ultimately, I went on the track to go through to university, where I completed a bachelor's degree in physics, mathematics, and then a master's degree in business, and ended up in sales and consulting. Now, from that, my lens on the world is very rational. The physics and mathematics components give me what I'd call more objective, tangible, and rational part of me. I'm not a very emotional thinker or decision maker. I am very much about the facts, the figures, what I can observe and then draw conclusions from. And then there's what I'd call the level of conservatism in me, which has been built from an Asian upbringing and religious foundations. And so when I came to Bitcoin from that lens, I think I was a natural fit, because Bitcoin does lean more towards conservatism and in that freedom and self-sovereignty, rather than the socialism side of a lot of where Western democratic societies are today. So I had a natural affinity towards Bitcoin, especially when I started diving into it in roughly 2020 or so. But the thing that was nagging at the back of my mind was that the principles that I was seeing around Bitcoin in those three buckets weren't quite resonating. And it took me a while to figure out why it wasn't resonating. And it was something that my father said when I was growing up that was the trigger for me. And that was that being raised as a Hindu, you had to pray to God, and we had to do that every single night. And I can't remember when, but he did say that religion is a way of life. It isn't that you are just praying to a God, but it's the way in which you live your life. And that, for whatever reason, really stuck with me. Because what I was able to see then was, and more so retrospectively later in life, reflecting on it, was that a lot of the things that religion was telling me to do was grounded in a level of wisdom. They were principles that if you followed, you would live a virtuous life. And so when I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about principles, I started to realize that the principles had to be more fundamental and foundational that anyone could interpret and then execute through the living of their life in the same way that a religion does. And what I was observing with these three buckets of principles were they weren't quite nailing it at that most fundamental level, taking it from my experience of a religious upbringing and living a life in the principles of Hinduism. And the second piece that then had me thinking slightly differently was a number of videos that I was seeing from Jordan Peterson. And now he has just released a book, We Who Wrestle with God. But there were a number of lead precursor talks that he did in the lead up to this book, where he really started to dive into the biblical texts and started to think deeper around what the message in these texts were. And when I looked at and listened to a lot of his work, and I looked at and remembered my father's words around the principles that you live by, I realized that there was something in religion here that I was missing in Bitcoin. Very strange comment to make, but I'll walk you through it. When you look at each of these principles of Bitcoin that I've just run through, they are very material in nature. The economic system in which we operate, the money that we use, the technology that we deploy. And I kept thinking to myself, what was it about these technology tools that were different to previous systems? Why was this working so much better than what had come before it? And that's where I got to my light bulb aha moment. When you look at what religion did with its principles, it was constraining certain human behaviors that were expressing themselves that were maybe beneficial in the short term, but very detrimental to you and your community and future generations long term. And when you look at what Bitcoin was doing, it was doing something very similar. Where the fiat system left the ability for individuals to pervert the system, Bitcoin put in place a number of tools that stopped people's ability as individuals to pervert the Bitcoin system. Things like decentralization, things like the supply cap, things like proof of work. These tools and mechanisms were constraining our ability to express certain behaviors that we could observe in the fiat system that were destroying that system. Bitcoin solved it. And the aha moment I came to was these principles that I was looking at across technology, across money and economics, across freedom and liberty. These principles ultimately were leading towards one thing, and that was human behavior. So let's dive into that in a bit more detail. There is an exercise that I picked up in my professional career called the abstraction ladder. And the abstraction ladder it's a very simple exercise, although it sounds complex. And all you need to do is, when you're trying to figure out the most fundamental, the most foundational, or the root cause of the particular problem that you are facing or the strategy that you're about to write, all you need to do is keep asking yourself why across a statement until you cannot ask why anymore. So as an example, and I'll run through a very fictitious and very basic example. You'll say, we're seeing a decline in our revenues and we need to fix it. Well, you would say, well, why are we seeing a decline in our revenues? Well, we're losing customers. Okay, well, why are you losing customers? Well, we need to go and ask them. So you go and ask your customers and they come back and they say, well, you're commercially not competitive and there are new products that are more innovative than what you're producing. And so you get to the ultimate reason for the decline in revenue that you need to solve for as being you are lagging behind the market and you're expensive. And so now at its root cause, you're able to create a strategy to tackle it fundamentally to ensure that you are then on a sustainable path into the future. Very basic example. Now, when you apply this abstraction letter exercise to a number of the statements that we find in Bitcoin's principles, both in academia and more broadly across the community and what we read through from Wikipedia and the like, you can apply the same exercise on some of the principles that they've come up with. And the one to demonstrate why it's about human behavior and not any of these principles that we've heard from so far, I'm going to take the first line from that academic article that I read through. And they said, scarcity is a prerequisite for ascribing value to any form of money. And if you apply this abstraction letter exercise just on this line, you ask, well, why is scarcity a prerequisite for ascribing value? And then my answer to that question was, well, if it isn't scarce, it is in human nature to create more of it. And just in that statement, to expand a bit more, if you create more of something, more of a money, but you've got a static demand for goods and services in that society, it leads to inflation, right? So you are devaluing the currency. But because it isn't scarce and it's easy to create, human beings will create it. And we've observed this over time, especially in this fiat system that we see today. We're seeing the money printer from the Federal Reserve go ballistic, and we keep printing money because we can't stop spending. So why is scarcity a prerequisite? Well, because human beings will create more of it if it's easy enough to do so. And then you keep going. You say, well, why do human beings want to create more of this thing knowing that it's going to destroy value in the long term? And that is where you get to the ultimate why. Because people are inherently greedy. Now, that's a hard thing to swallow. And this is where, going back to the foundations from where I came from, which was a religious upbringing, we know that human beings are inherently flawed. We know that we give in to a number of behaviors that we know are short-term, really enjoyable, but long-term can be at our detriment. Think gambling, think drugs and alcohol. Deep down, we all know that these are bad things, but in the moment they feel great. But long-term, we know that they're not in our best interest, and yet we do it anyway. And so we do know that human beings are flawed and that we have these behaviors that we often can't control ourselves. And so while greed may come as a very shocking, a very confronting term to use, ultimately it is greed that drives our printing of money in this fiat system. And so the reason why scarcity is a prerequisite for ascribing value to any form of money is because human beings are inherently greedy and will take the easy way out. And so that is then sloth, our aversion to doing work. So just even in that example, we've gone from scarcity is a principle for ascribing value to money. It's a core value of maintaining a hard money is scarcity. But in reality, the reason why we need it is not because of a monetary challenge. It is because it's a human behavior challenge. And when you go through this abstraction letter exercise across all the various components of Bitcoin, technologies of Bitcoin, fundamental principles as we currently see them in terms of economic, money, freedom, sovereignty, and the like, I always get to the ultimate, the most foundational, the most fundamental principle, which is it ultimately comes down to adverse human behaviors. And so the first principle that I truly believe is the core principle of Bitcoin is minimizing adverse human behaviors. And everything that I've just walked through, from academia through to the internet, through my observations of the community itself, is downstream of that core principle, minimizing adverse human behaviors. And this was the big aha moment. This is the thing that has formed the foundations for my research. And in the next video, I want to go through this minimizing adverse human behaviors in far more detail. But there are two other principles that are woven through Bitcoin, which I'll touch on a high level now, and we'll dive into more detail in a subsequent podcast. And that is The second principle of Bitcoin is meritocracy. And the third principle of Bitcoin is simplicity. And so the three principles that I put forward as what I believe are the core principles of Bitcoin are minimizing adverse human behaviors, meritocracy, and simplicity. These are the highest order of things that I can come to, the most fundamental and most foundational. And meritocracy and simplicity are symbiotic, because you can't have a meritocratic system which isn't simple. Because by nature, if it's not simple, it is exclusionary, and it means that only a select number of experts are able to engage, interact, and change the system itself. And so to have a truly meritocratic system, everybody needs to be able to understand and participate. And so you cannot have meritocracy without simplicity. And meritocracy is woven into the very fabric of Bitcoin. When you look at things like proof of work, it is meritocratic based on the efforts that you put in. It's about the work that you do. It's not about some status that you hold. When you look at how changes can be made to Bitcoin itself, when you look at how hard forks need to occur and how you get to community consensus as to which changes are adopted, it is very much a grassroots meritocratic process that you need to go through in order to have a hope of enacting that kind of change. And so just in those two examples, you've got a very, very clear line of sight towards meritocracy being the foundations for Bitcoin. And in the same way, for any kind of meritocratic change to occur, it has to be simple for the masses to understand. Because if you think about Bitcoin being ubiquitous across the globe, we're not going to be talking to engineers. We're not going to be talking to monetary theorists or Bitcoin core devs and all of those technically smart and savvy people. We're now going to be talking to everyday people who are in very, very diverse fields that are using this as their system of money. And so you need it to be simple enough for all of those people to be able to be participating in the system for it to be truly meritocratic. And so the three principles, again, minimizing adverse human behaviors, meritocracy, and simplicity. So I'm going to leave you there with those three core principles. And the thing about these principles is when you take a step back and you say, if I didn't know this was Bitcoin, and I just heard, hey, the principles are minimizing adverse human behaviors, simplicity, and meritocracy, would you be able to realize that I was talking about Bitcoin? And the reality of that is you wouldn't be able to. What you've gotten to are principles that are independent of money itself. And this is where the exciting thing about this then becomes. If Bitcoin is as revolutionary as we believe it will be for our civilization moving forward, a return to hard money, a return to meritocracy, a return to simplicity and inclusion, then the learnings that we get from this journey of Bitcoin and money, we can now start to scale beyond money and apply it to all the other pillars of our civilization. Imagine taking the success of Bitcoin and applying it into the field of politics, into the field of healthcare, into the field of education. These principles are so powerful because they are so fundamental in nature. These principles are so powerful because they can be applied to every element of our civilization. And the point that I will make in the next video, which will be Bitcoin's Principles Part 2, minimizing adverse human behaviors, we will go through those behaviors and why we need to solve for this, not just in money, but everywhere else in our civilization. And so the next episode, to give you a preview as to what's to come, we're going to be talking about minimizing adverse human behaviors. The following podcast will be about simplicity and meritocracy. And the third podcast will be the first interview that I do on this podcast with an expert in the field. I've got a question in my mind around adoption curves, and specifically the next wave of people adopting Bitcoin. And I am incredibly excited to announce that Robin Sayer will be on the podcast in the next 2 to 3 weeks to be able to discuss this with me. And I draw from his experience of interviewing over 320 different Bitcoiners around the world in the last year on his perspectives as to what he's seeing as the next wave of adoption. So, firstly, if you've made it this far, a huge thank you, because these are long episodes and they can be, I admit, maybe a bit dry, but I think it is incredibly important to be able to articulate this research in a long form format. So if you've made it this far, it would mean the world to me if you were to like, subscribe, and share this with your network. I want to grow this podcast to as big as possible to reach as many people as possible. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.